Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. So I move this disallowance motion, and I'm allowed to now
speak.
You
want to speak to it?
Yep. Okay, thank you very much.
Please,
the
floor is yours, Senator Bragg.
Thank you very much.
We haven't heard much of you
today.
So.
We've always good to see a Geelong supporter in the chair. Now, the point of this contribution is that the country is living through probably its greatest housing crisis since the end of the Second World War. And what we have seen, I take the interjection, and what we have seen is a failure of this government, and then we see a moronic repetition of slogans as if all these things that they've announced are going to solve the nation's housing crisis. And in fact, you can have your own slogans in politics, and one of the reasons that people don't think very highly of politicians is because they utter too many slogans, and they often are prone to offering empty words. I mean, in fact, you'll see if you watch this debate this afternoon, you'll probably find politicians in this chamber actually reading their speeches because they're actually not really sure what they're supposed to be saying. But I look forward to seeing that. So the main point is that the government have failed on housing. That is not in question. And whilst you can have your own slogans, you can't have your own facts. And the facts are that we have never had a bigger population than we have right now in Australia. We've had a massive surge in population, the biggest surge since the 1950s, and we've had a massive collapse in completions. So the biggest population we've ever had simultaneously comes with the biggest collapse in housing construction in decades. So the government says it's done a great job on housing, but the scoreboard shows that under the last coalition government we saw 200,000 houses being built across Australia a year on average. 200,000. Under this government, we're down to 170,000 houses a year on average. So we've gone from 200,000 houses a year on average to 170,000 houses a year on average. Despite all the bluster about housing, Labor's bureaucracies have resulted in fewer houses than the former government. And the Housing Minister is fond of saying that the government has spent $43 billion. Well, big deal. It spent $43 billion to build fewer houses than were built under the last coalition government. That is the position that Australia finds itself in, and that is why the housing squeeze is so severe, because when you have a bigger population, you need to find more houses, and when you've had a housing construction collapse, you've got a big problem. So all you need to do is look at the government's own program, the Housing Australia Future Fund. It would be one of the greatest failures of public administration in my lifetime, and it has had 2 years of operation now. It has $10 billion in its budget, and it has built, we think, either 0 or 17 or 2,000 houses. Now, we don't know the actual answer because, according to the Centre for Public Integrity, this is the most secretive government since the Keating government. And this government has gone out of its way to block access to information. So we have no idea actually how many houses have been built by this Housing Australia Future Fund, because the government has covered it all up, because this is the most secretive government since the Keating government, according to the Public Integrity Centre. What a disgraceful record for a government that campaigned on transparency and integrity. Hypocrisy is thy name. So the government's flagship program has built either 0, 17 or 2,000 houses in 2 years. And then you have the broader failure to encourage the builders and the tradespeople and the developers to get the housing sector moving. And we see there the failure on the housing accord. They're supposed to build 1.2 million houses, but they'll be lucky to get to 1 million. So the starting point is a massive failure on supply, and that is why people are battling, because if you build fewer houses, you create problems all the way down the chain. And that is why Homelessness Australia says that homelessness has never been worse than it is right now under this government. Homelessness is a disaster right now under this government, despite all the bluster. And then you've got to think to yourself, well, you know, if I look at all the social media and all the speeches that the Housing Minister gives and all the press releases, you'd think that the housing problem has been solved. And she keeps on talking about the $43 billion. Yeah, that's right. $43 billion for fewer houses and more homelessness. What a shocking record. What a shocking record for a government that says it's committed to housing. That's the supply side. And then we get to the demand side. We see this week the government's proposed to expand the home guarantee scheme, which it will be able to do without any parliamentary oversight. Again, this is the most secretive government since the Keating government. And so they'll make this change to the home guarantee scheme. There's likely to be a $62 billion contingent liability in the budget. But, you know, when you're already running 10 years of deficits, who cares? It's all just monopoly money to Mr Chalmers. And so the expansion of the home guarantee scheme takes it from a scheme that was designed to be about lower income people getting access to a first home where they have no or low deposit. That's the idea, because the home guarantee scheme is not about paying your mortgage. It's not about servicing your mortgage. It was about helping people who have no deposit or low deposit. So it's gone from a lower income targeted scheme to a scheme that any Australian can use, including the wealthiest Australians. And as I say, when you're running 10 years of deficits, maybe you don't give a rat's about a few bucks here and there, but I would have thought that a $62 billion contingent liability would be material, because the consequence of that is that the average worker has to subsidise potentially the children of billionaires being able to access a government program. Now, I take the interjection, we believe in the idea that government programs should be targeted for people that need it. We do not believe that programs funded by hard-working taxpayers, when you've got a massive burden on the working Australian, maybe the highest that we've ever had, you're wanting now, and this comes from a government that reintroduced a tax bracket in the last parliament, 37 cents. You've got to be very careful with how you spend people's money, and subsidising the children of billionaires, I would say, is not a good priority. And on priorities, of all the things for this government to do on housing, they choose something put forward by their mates at the big super funds and the big investors. I know. Let's give a tax cut to foreign fund managers. Let's give a tax cut to foreign fund managers so they can build and own houses in perpetuity that Australians will never own, and we'll dress it up as a build-to-rent measure. But in reality, it is cutting the withholding tax rate for foreign asset managers. What a warped and bizarre priority. And when we did the inquiry into this bill, we asked the Home Building Association, people who actually build houses, or used to build houses in Australia, you know, where would this priority sit? Where would this priority sit? You know what they said? It wouldn't be in our top 20. It wouldn't be in our top 20. So the Home Building Association say that it would not be in their top 20. But there you go. This issue, a tax cut for Labor's big end-of-town mates, becomes the priority for the government. And so they want to now have this system where Australians never, ever, ever, ever own a house. And anyone who went to the economic summit last week with Mr Chalmers would have found that, in fact, a lot of the time was taken up by the big super funds trying to get the government to find dodgy ways so they can own and build more and more houses, because their Australian dream is for super funds to own your house, not for you to own your house. That's the reality of this government. They believe that institutional investors should own houses because they don't give a rat's that there are cities like in Atlanta and in other parts of the US where you have 25 or 30% of the houses owned by institutional investors. That's what they want for Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. They want Cbus, BlackRock, Australian Super to own the houses in Australia. That's their dream. That is their dream. That is the Labor dream. The party of organised capital now wants to impose this disgusting idea on the Australian people because, in fact, they've never liked the idea of individual Australians owning their own houses. And if you go back into the annals of time, you'll find the Labor ministers in the post-war period talking about we don't want to have Australians own their own houses because we don't want them to be little capitalists. That is the history of the Labor movement. So this is just, frankly, more of the same. And so we see here from the ASFA, which is the Super Association, saying
senators.
Senator Bragg, please take your seat. Senator Ayres, senators, interjections are always disorderly, and I would ask senators to be mindful of that. particularly given we are so close to a maiden speech and we have an audience, we should all be on our best behaviour. Senator Ayres.
We will, of course, absolutely respect your warning. We were provoked by Senator Bragg naming an association that does not exist. He just made it up. He just made it up.
That's not in order. Under the standing order, Senator Bragg, I'm giving you the call to continue with your contribution on the motion. Thank you.
I thank you, Acting Deputy President. I thank Senator Ayres for his many interjections. He likes interjecting when I'm speaking, I've noticed. And the Housing Industry Association does a lot of very good home building, I think you'll find. And I encourage you to go to their website. You might find some facts about home building.
Through the chair, Senator Bragg.
Which I encourage the government to get better at understanding what builders, tradies and developers actually need to build the houses Australians want to live in. Because I have to say that Canberra-based bureaucracies like the Housing in Australia Future Fund that have been going for 2 years and have spent $10 billion to build 17 houses haven't been very successful. So I take the interjection. I thank Senator Ayres for his many interjections, and I'd make the point here that the Superfund Association, when giving evidence on this particular bill, actually said, when I asked them, do you think the Australian people want to rent their house from a super fund, the official said, I think they would be very happy with institutionally owned residential property. Now, I think that they're wrong. I think that is culturally jarring, that most Australians actually want to own their own house. Most Australians want to own their own house. They don't want to own a house. They don't want to live in a house, as you say, owned by a super fund. Now, it shows you the institutional impact of the Labor movement today, that it is so obsessed with helping the super funds and the unions clip the ticket and become perpetual landlords that it now prioritises a policy of build to rent over the interests of Australian workers. So, I mean, that is effectively the basis for this disallowance. That this is a warped priority. A warped priority. It will cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. But, of course, the costs that the Labor movement don't want to talk about are the 30% taxes that the CFMEU impose onto all the new apartment builds in Australia. And, in fact, we saw one of the first acts of this government when it won election in 2022 was to abolish the Building and Construction Commission. And I think it's telling that I've often said this is a government for vested interests, Senator Ayres.
Right,
Senator Ayres, you are the king of vested interests in shoveling money and
Senator
policy
Ayres.
to your mates. And the reality is that the first order of business for this government was to abolish the Building and Construction Commission. Now, no one thinks that was a good idea other than the Labor Party and its mates. What it's done is it has imposed a 30% tax on all new apartment builds for younger Australians. So for many younger Australians, their first house is likely to be a small apartment. So imposing that cost on younger people seems very unfair to me. But again, Labor really only care about the vested interest because they are at heart a government for vested interest. So the general point here is that we believe this is an important disallowance because this is a warped priority that only a government for vested interests could conjure up. This is not in the interest of the Australian people, because we want to have a country where individual Australians can own their own house. We don't think that it's a good idea for big super funds and foreign asset managers to own Australian houses. No, we don't. And I take all the interjections, and it must be a very sore point. But we don't believe that foreign asset managers and big super funds should be the perpetual owners of Australian housing. So I'm sorry that the government is embarrassed, but we don't think this is the right priority. And so we're moving this disallowance because we want to see Australians being back in the vanguard of housing policy. We accept the election result, and we understand that the government have another couple of years to try and get it right on housing. And we want to help the government be the best that they can be. And the way that will be measured will be on the supply numbers. If you can build more houses that Australians can live in, that's a good thing. But you've got to get the priorities right. And so we encourage the Senate to consider carefully whether it's a good idea for the Australian taxpayer to be giving away money to foreign asset managers so they can own houses in perpetuity that Australians will never, ever, ever own. Think very carefully about where we're heading in this country. There is a massive conspiracy between Mr Chalmers, the unions, the big super funds to become perpetual landlords, and it's not a good idea. And the caterwauling and the crying from the Labor Party on the government benches really is a testament to their great embarrassment, that this is finally going to be exposed. So we encourage the Senate to vote for this disallowance. And more broadly, we want to see the government get serious on the supply side. Their measures so far have been a disaster. They've had 3 years, they've gone backwards. They've got another 2.5 years or so, and we want to see the government get to the 250,000 houses that are required for Australia to hit its targets. And while they're doing that, we want to see them be serious about the demand side. Is it really a good idea for the government to be giving a program which is now open to the wealthiest Australians to get access to a government insurance scheme? We would say it's best to means test things. Taxpayer dollars should be treated very carefully, and giving away money to the wealthiest Australians when they don't need that money is really not appropriate. So I encourage the Senate to consider this motion carefully once we get through the formalities of this next speech.